Following on from our discussion about CSS and its kind of historical place, as well as kind of where to look for some extra resources, we go back to the actual page we were working on last, which was the Penguins page. And we now have a lot of files in there. So we have our style CSS, we have a lightbox minified CSS, we've got these additional things in there which all kind of make up the main page we're looking at. So when we go back to looking at the actual rendered page, here's what we get. If we zoom out, you can see that's kind of what's happening with the background, because that's what we agreed upon, that we weren't really going to mess around with that. But we still haven't done much around the containers and positions of these things. And so what we want to do is we want to get clear about what is content. And when we do have content, let's just say I'm going to copy and paste that in here. We might have content 1 and content 2. Now the moment I do that, and I'll show you, this whole thing breaks, because the two, and I'll rename these as well, just so it's, instead of explore my images, it'll be content 1 and content 2. But when we're looking back at what we have, it just collapses on itself because it doesn't have those rules applied to it anymore. And when we were looking at CSS before, the style that we set up for that particular item is all the way up here in this content. And if we were to instead change our mind about what this actually is, and you'll see that we get into problems anyway, but if we were to change the hash and do something different and say, look, this is going to be a column, this is a column of text, then what we can do going back in here is add a class of column. And so therefore both of these items will become column items, even though they have different names. Now the way that renders on the page again is different, because content 1, and I have to demonstrate this by just deleting content 2, is sitting underneath content. And the way that that works is that the specifics of it works like layers, and therefore anything that gets defined first, which is content 1, is then overshadowed by content 2, which is the next layer that gets created, which goes on top, and therefore we see content 2. Now I can go in here and do something terrible like this, and I can say that from the right you're going to be 200 pixels, and then go back into the browser, refresh that, and there it is. I've pushed this out 200 pixels from the right, and I've left that one over there. So what's happening is we grab some basic rules, and I could actually get rid of this, by the way, because we're not using it yet. We will, but if I got rid of that, we're now sharing some values, some CSS values between these two items. And as far as the browser is concerned, that's all it needs to do. So at the same time we could say, okay, well they're both columns and I want them to behave like columns, but what I'll have is I'll have the column 1 here, which I don't need to name, be positioned left of the screen and 20 pixels, and then that will in effect put it over on the left hand side. They'll still look identical, they have different content inside of them, but they will behave the same way. So the stuff that we put in them will behave the same way. Now I can go and change anything around this, because what we set out in our style sheet here for what the class of column, or the definition of column is all these things. So we could go and we could change the background color. We just need to grab that property, go back in here, and say, look, you also have a background property which is going to be different. This particular background property will just do that, whatever color that turns out to be. And when you refresh, you'll see that that becomes a different color. Still gets all the same properties. And this is where IDing things becomes very useful, because writing CSS in line like this is very dangerous because you could forget where you put it. It's much better to have it in your style sheet. So what you can do is you can grab all of that and take it out of here, give this particular div a class that defines its, it broadly, and then give it an ID. In this case, we'll just say content 1. You could say content left, you could say column 1, whatever you want to. And we'll give this one a different ID of content 2. Now with IDs, you can't use the same ID twice. So if we were to call this content 1, it's going to complain. You're going to get this little red thing saying this ID must be unique. And when you change it to 2, it'll go away and be happy again. Whereas column, because it's a class, you can have it on as many items as you want. Doesn't matter. So going back in here into the style, and so here's our column, and then we're just going to say hash content 1, and then in squigglies we're going to put in all of that. Now the problem is I've also grabbed some HTML, which we don't want, which is the style equals, because that basically tells HTML do some CSS. So we delete that, and we only want to leave the left and the background, and also this double quote from the style, we get rid of that. So what happens is column 1 gets created, and then I'll just copy this for content 2 just to prove a point. And then what we'll do is we'll preview that, and you can see that we've changed this background and this background, but we've only changed content 1's position to be over on the left. Now because they're kind of set up to be on the left and the right hand side, they'll just do their little business and float around that way. But it should give you an idea that what we're doing in terms of just tidying up our CSS is that we're trying to get all the repetitive stuff that happens again and again inside of a class, which is prefixed by that little dot that tells it it's a class, and have all these specific things that only apply to an individual item with a little hash in front of it. And that becomes a more important rule because of its hash. So hashes are more important than dots because hashes are individuals and dots are groups. And groups are broad strokes, whereas the hashes are the more fine little detail strokes that you're putting onto your actual render that you're putting together. And if you take it out, if you take the rules out, what happens is it defaults back to all of these. So if I refresh this, you see they just go and stack on top of each other again. And it's as simple as that. So having these rules is great. It just gives you that structure, because you can just say, look, all of my columns are going to be this. They're going to be that wide. They're going to have that font. They're going to have that color. But this particular one is 20 pixels from the left and has a different background color. You could change anything again from these and it'll override that behavior and work that way. So hopefully that's given you a bit of a glimpse on how powerful CSS can be when you start optimizing it. And what we'll do is we'll just keep looking at these little bits and pieces and you know, for another maybe couple of days until everyone's comfortable with this enough, so that you're writing it with the right kind of frame of mind from the beginning. So you're saying, okay, here are some rules that will apply to many elements, make it a class. And then you'll also say, okay, but here's a specific position of an element, or here's a specific instance of an element, and then you'll create an ID, which we did for the menu already, and I think that's appropriate. I wouldn't want to make a class for it because there's not going to be menus, it's only a single thing. As for the content, we've got these two different columns, so again we would want to come up with some kind of naming for it. Anyway, hopefully that makes sense. Let me know in the comments if it does or not, and we will catch up on the next one. Cheers.